This week on Dialogue, we speak with author Eliza Griswold about her new book, The 10th Parallel, Dispatches from the Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest this week is Eliza Griswold. Eliza is an award-winning journalist and poet. She is currently a fellow at the New America Foundation, is a former Neiman Fellow at Harvard University, and a former Wilson Center Fellow. Thank you, Eliza.
Thank you, John.
For joining us today.
Thanks for
having me. The book is
me.
terrific. As I said to you before we began recording, this is an epic work. 7 years of your life committed to this. And as we were saying, some people write books in 7 weeks. Let's start with the title. Tell us about the significance of the geographic reference.
Well, the title, The 10th Parallel, comes from quite literally the word of the line of latitude. Now, I always have to remember lat is flat. That's my kind of third grade remembering. But so it comes from the line of latitude 700 miles north of the equator. So if the equator is here.
Or here.
Or look at this handy. I've never had this. Here's the equator. The 10th parallel, this is is just about midway here. It's the midway point. And so if it's not confusing to keep using the globe.
No, sure, go right ahead.
Terrific. Okay, so here from West Africa all the way over the Indian Ocean through Southeast Asia, Christianity and Islam largely meet. They meet in the space between the equator and the 10th parallel, and that's where I have been traveling over the past 7 years. Now, they meet here for various reasons. The first is geography and wind. This is the space, we'll just start since we'll go from west to east. This is the space here in Africa where the dry north, the dry northern third of the continent, meets the wet south, right along this band. And here where the wet south begins, the jungle begins, and so do tsetse flies. And so during the 19th century, 18th and 19th, as Islamic traders and missionaries were spreading the faith over the northernmost third of Africa, south, riding south, when they hit the 10th parallel, where tsetse flies began and the jungle began, they had to stop because they were riding camels and horses. The camels and horses were killed off by sleeping sickness, which the tsetse flies carried. So that, for the most part, when the European colonialists arrived, is the southernmost line of the Muslim world here in Africa. And so when the Europeans arrived, they really populated very strongly right along this line, and some missionaries came along with them, many with just the intent to do good work, others with the express purpose of stopping Islam in Africa, stopping it from winning the continent. And the Brits actually split Sudan on the 10th parallel in 1904, making it illegal for Christian missionaries to work among Muslims in the north. The reason of this being was that it was too they didn't want trouble. They didn't want more trouble with Islam, which they'd already had. So what we're seeing today, this clash between Christianity and Islam, which is much more varied than any kind of oversimplified clash of civilizations, largely this is a 100-year, at least, confrontation. Then just to finish, in Asia, this is where two patterns of wind meet near the equator, and this is where the trade winds carried Christian and Muslim traders and missionaries to the same beaches, ports, and islands, much as Hindu and Buddhist before them. So the actual sites of contest, I'm looking here at Malacca, which is in current Malaysia. The Portuguese knocked out a mosque, they built a cathedral, and they said, guess what? We own these trade routes now. So the use of religion and politics and power is certainly nothing new. That's a centuries-old struggle here along this space.
Well, before today, this was just a prop, but you made it a useful AV tool.
I might be taking it with me, so keep your eyes on it.
Nice globe. We've referenced the roughly 7 years. Did you start out writing a book? Or
Yeah, I did.
You did, from the very beginning.
I started out because I was very curious. I mean, not only is this line geographic, it's demographic as well. So, I found it shocking when I started. I knew so very little about global faith. And even the statistic of the world's billion Muslims, because there are a billion Muslims in the world, 4 out of 5 live outside the Middle East. That to me...
Which is news to Americans.
Yeah, and it was news to me. And so I wanted to go to the places where that more than half of the world's Muslims met with about half of the world's 2 billion Christians. And that doesn't happen in the Middle East. That happens, I mean, it certainly happens in Jerusalem in a very small way, as the most pronounced fault line I can think of, but it happens across cultures and continents here. And so I wanted to go to where the world is breaking apart. I wanted to see firsthand what this clash of civilizations, so-called, actually means on the ground.
Mm-hmm. And the daughter of an Episcopal bishop, and you've referred to yourself as a religious seeker. Could you give us some insight into how that shaped your worldview and these interests that developed?
Sure. Well, in a couple of important ways. I mean, I certainly grew up in a household where faith and intellect were very much interrelated. How do smart people believe in God? How does the mind make sense of the divine? Those were questions. I often say that if Jesuits could have kids, I'd be a Jesuit kid. So that was very important for me when I was a small person. And, you know, one thing I had seen firsthand with my father toward the end of his term as the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, which is the head bishop for America, about 2 million people, he had elected, actually the people of New Hampshire had elected the first openly homosexual bishop, Gene Robinson. And my father consecrated him, as was his job, to follow through with this democratic process. To do that, my father had to wear a bulletproof vest under his vestments. It wasn't out of fear that some Muslim terrorist was going to come running down the aisle. It was out of the fear of a fellow believer, a fellow Christian believer, would take such issue with this clash inside Christianity over what is okay, who is a true believer and who is not, that somebody might actually take my father's life. So that kind of divide within, first of all, I think that the most overlooked religious conflict we have today is the clash within religions, within Christianity, within Islam. And we certainly see that playing out at Ground Zero, over Park 51, the proposed mosque and community center. We see that on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial here. What does it mean? Who has the right to speak for God? That's not just a question between Christians and Muslims.
Fundamentalists, to use the word broadly, claim that right more than not.
That seems to be absolutely the case, that with these, both within Christianity and Islam, these revivals over the past several decades, we've seen these huge movements, effervescent, extremely dynamic movements within both faiths, that believers have reclaimed the right to have a direct and personal relationship with God. Now, what that means is largely that traditional systems of maybe power between the priest or any kind of intermediary is gone. And so many believers on both sides claim not only the right to know God's will, but the right to direct access to understanding that through strict and literal adherence to the texts, to the Bible, to the Quran. And that's where things can get problematic, because those who believe there is only one way to be saved frequently think all others, they think they're wrong at best and evil at worst.
Sinners by definition, almost.
Sinners by definition, and then for those people looking to whip up fear in followers, it's very easy to demonize the other. It's the quickest way to get a following, is to say, look across the divide. Look at Islam. Isn't it out to get us? Well, you better follow me, because I'm going to save you.
You referenced the Samuel Huntington construction of a clash of civilizations, and others who've tried to create a more positive notion have talked about a dialogue of civilizations. Without sacrificing complexity, give us some insight into what you encountered.
You know, first of all, I think the dialogue piece, unless it's substantive, we are at the end of kind of mealy-mouthed interfaith dialogue. I have never seen it to be profitable. In 7 years of traveling along this fault line, what works is not when people of different faiths get together and say, I believe this. Really? I believe this. I have not seen that to be productive. What does work is when they pull in a third element. Whether that element, this happens to be one of the most sensitive environmental zones in the world because of those same patterns of wind and weather, because it's that fault line where dry and wet meet. because two kinds of wind meet there. Colossal storms are generated sometimes within this line. It's called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. They spin off the west coast of Africa, they go over the Atlantic Ocean, and they strike America's east coast as Atlantic hurricanes. In that way, religion is like the weather, in that you cannot separate what's happening here from what's happening there. Right. And so, yes, absolutely, it is a fundamentalist trend to see the other as sinners at best, evil at worst. And that is a lot of what I'm trying to do, is to provide a more nuanced understanding of people through their own voices.
So much of your book looks at these various factors. It's a science book as much as it is a religion book in that regard. When did that become evident to you? You went out as a religious seeker, and you were trying to understand this fault line between these two great faiths. And then, you became a geographer and a climate scientist, and all these other things came into play. When did that become evident to you that this was a big, big part of the story?
Pretty late in the game.
Really?
Well, when I started reporting the book, so yes, I started very much with the understanding that this was an important fault line, because it was very much in the evangelical community. There was a lot of talk about this line of latitude as being the beginning of the Muslim world. And so, therefore, the place where people had to begin to focus their efforts for salvation, right? So I'd heard a lot of talk about this, and I thought, basically, I come from a background in poetry and journalism. I thought I would be writing kind of Naipaul-esque travelogue. That was my intention. And it was only when I started traveling along this line that I saw how profound the geographic and demographic realities were, and that I needed to come to grips with, wait a second, how does the weather, because I could tell really two kinds of people meet on top of two different kinds of land in Africa, and at this particular meeting place in Southeast Asia. So it really forced me to do the work. The shape that the book took is really what came to me, and I had to tell the story. It wasn't the other way around.
No. And you also referenced earlier the notion that religion is used as a tactic or a tool. Talk a bit about that, too. Help us understand how much of this is about interfaith misunderstanding or differences, and how much is that just a masquerade?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that I really believe that I saw that the world is breaking down on tribal lines, and the greatest of those tribes is religion. So from that point, does that mean that religion doesn't really come to bear on these conflicts? Not at all. And a lot of what I needed to do, so I never saw a religious conflict that didn't have some kind of secular or worldly trigger, whether that was land, oil, water, even in Indonesia, chocolate. Crops of chocolate, right? So, because when global cacao prices spiked, so did tension between Christians and Muslims. All of a sudden, it was ideological. That said, never did I see the people who believed they were fighting in the name of their religion absolutely believed they were fighting in the name of their religion. So, most of the book is about bringing those voices back. So, who am I to say, you say it's about God, but it's not about God, it's just about the chocolate? I couldn't find somewhere in the spectrum, in every single case, there's an answer. But to generalize from there was exactly what I was trying not to do. I was trying to take off this monotheistic clash and look closer at what's actually happening on the ground.
And people are complex, so it's almost impossible to divide
exactly
motivations. Right. This rift between moderates and fundamentalists, I want to talk a bit more about that. Does that ultimately have to lead to violence?
No, definitely not.
So fundamentalism doesn't automatically lead to violence. So what is the factor that pushes people to violence?
Well, some fundamentalists, and I didn't know this before I began the book either, especially certainly within Christianity, we have many examples of fundamentalists who preach a withdrawal from society, who preach a withdrawal from political life, and therefore are much less likely to clash with anyone because they're in isolation. The same is true in Islam, that a lot of these guys, we hear this word Salafi a lot. Oh, Salafi, it's kind of the new tagline for Wahhabi, right? It's slightly more politically correct. So many Salafis, which means companions, want to return to the world, the 7th century world of how things were when the Prophet Muhammad was alive. They believe, many of them today, some of them Salafi jihadis are the most violent people we need to watch and who are out to get us without question. Others believe in withdrawal from all kinds of aspects of secular life, political life. Even they did believe, these really hardliners, that jihad is illegitimate because there's no leader on earth who is allowed to declare it. So does fundamentalism always lead to violence? No. Does the clash inside of religion lead to violence? Sometimes, yes. Does it shape the future of religion? More so than any other single factor.
Who's winning the clash within Islam? Is it possible to see momentum on one side or another?
Well, here's the thing. I would say the quick answer to that would be absolutely, unfortunately, conservatives. Now, I think that's wrong, because I think that that's the voices we hear. As we have that own thing in our own society, we have a nut job standing up and saying he's going to burn Qurans. The whole world thinks
the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Exactly.
But not necessarily represents the mass.
100%. And what I am seeing in both Christianity and Islam is that the silent majority, those quiet moderates who just have said, oh gosh, can't we leave all this to the side, are beginning to speak back. They are beginning to say, you know what, you don't speak for my God, you don't speak for my faith, and I'm going to get out there and say something.
Mm-hmm. Another factor I want to ask you about, poverty.
Yeah.
How does that factor into the equation?
You know, it's hard. So these people one of the reasons that evangelicals have targeted this line as the beginning of the Muslim world is because these are the poorest people on the face of the planet. Statistically, most of the people who live within this zone make less than $500 a year. So, have I found experientially that people who are poorer have a closer relationship to God? Yes, I have found that to be the case. I, though, have also found that I am in the least position. I started from a secular viewpoint. You know, I'm a reporter. I went out to find out, well, why do you believe in God? I would ask people. Well, there really, any kind of sociological context I would put on why they believe what they believe was inherently limited, because I have my own context, and I was reading them through a particular lens. So what I was trying to do is bring their stories back as much as I could without putting my lens on who they were.
Yeah, filter free. What of the stories and the many stories you tell in here, and this notion of poverty, I think it was in the Philippines, one of the stories you tell, where someone who had been a victim of violence had been sympathetic and said that she recognized jihad as a career move for someone who had no other options.
That woman is Gracia Burnham. She is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met, a woman who is devoted to a life of service and devoted to a life of service to God, to her perception of God. She was held captive by Abu Sayyaf, which the Al-Qaeda-linked group in Indonesia, who is so thuggish that even Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law said, you know what, I'm not giving you guys any more money until you clean up your act. These guys are awful. Mm-hmm. They use Islam, as many people do, to make some money. And their greatest money maker, kidnapping. So they held Gracia and her husband, Martin Burnham, for over a year in the Philippines. This came to our focus internationally, even though they'd already been held because of September 11th. When Martin died, her husband was shot to death, not by Abu Sayyaf, but by the Filipino military who came through trying to rescue them. And Gracia herself was shot in the leg. She brought her children home. She lives in Rose Hill, Kansas. She writes about that experience through the lens of martyrdom. We, in our understanding, certainly in our sort of secular media world, hear a lot about martyrdom in an Islamic context. Well, for many Christians, it is absolutely, there are 60 to 70 million martyrs, Christian martyrs worldwide, and most of them became martyrs in the 20th century. So Gracia has been held up, she and her husband, especially since he was killed, have been held up as examples of Christian martyrs for the 21st century. Gracia's understanding of God, of who Jesus Christ is and was, is extremely different than my own personal context. She definitely believes that salvation is a one-way reality. When she was with these men who really couldn't have starving her to death, she prayed for them. And a couple of them have since converted to Christianity. she prayed for them out of an understanding that that's what God would want her to do. So although her ideology and mine could not be worlds apart, she has found in hers a level of empathy that I've never seen in any other context.
It's the amazing power of forgiveness, explicitly exemplified by that story.
Yeah.
And one of the unfortunate and almost universal stories of human history, and not just of this, the 10th parallel, is that women and children often carry the worst load of victimhood. Talk to us a bit about that, how that's playing out on the 10th parallel.
Oh, that's absolutely without a question true. Well, first of all, we'll just start with children. One issue in West Africa that doesn't get enough airtime so we'll give it now. It's a proper due. In West Africa, in Nigeria alone, there are 23 million, which is a state statistic, suspect, because as all state statistics in Nigeria are a bit suspect, but 23 million young children who have no schooling at all, and they follow a kind of schooling that we know from Pakistan, from Waziristan, in terms of madrasa education. Mm-hmm. There it's called al-Majri youth. It's not that the Saudis have come in and funded hardline al-Majri schools at all. This is one of those curious places where the weather gets into it, because these schools are, most of Africa's 400 million Muslims live to the north of the 10th parallel. They live in northern Nigeria. What is happening as desertification really sweeps farms into sand dunes in northern Nigeria is that used to be kids would travel from all over there, like itinerant students. They would travel to a teacher's farm. School was free. They paid back that money by working on the farm. Mm-hmm. The farms have collapsed. The farms are gone. Those teachers have moved south. They've moved to Abuja. They've moved to, which is the capital of Nigeria. They've moved to slums. They've moved to edges of cities. Kids do make money for them now. How? By begging. This informal education that used to be quite strong, again, Islamic education, is now totally collapsed, and it's creating a system of thuggery and violence that 23 million young people in Nigeria alone are now caught in. That's the kind of attention that I hope this book can bring to the way in which, in the absence of any kind of state, there's a total failure of any agency to take care of its most vulnerable people.
And speaking of bringing attention to things, you're in the midst of this book tour. Talk to us about the reception. Did you find, is there a hunger for information about Islam?
I have been shocked, I must say. I thought, I wrote this dutiful, earnest book that I hoped would be compelling to like-minded individuals and those fundamentalists, because I was trying to explain, really be a translator of sorts from one world to the next. It hit the New York Times bestseller list the week it came out. I can't really account for that. Of course, there is what's going on in our context, but meaning ground zero.
Timing is everything.
Yeah, and also, I think there's a huge hunger about Islam. I think any information that can convey the diversity of voices, that can simply say, you know what, there are as many voices inside Islam as Christianity, that alone is a piece of information. I mean, that same thing, 4 out of 5 Muslims live outside of the Middle East. What? Are people open to the information or resistant to it? What are you? Hugely
can you generalize?
Open and
Great.
Hungry. Maybe that's just because I've had friendly crowds so far.
Well, that's at least that's good news. We'll take it as much as we can get. Looking ahead, what are the dominant trends? We've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about poverty and climate change. What are the trends that people should keep an eye on as they watch this Clash v. Dialogue scenario play out? We should definitely
be increasingly aware that the weather in Africa and in Asia directly affects us. So as these storms worsen in Africa and Asia, and they spin west, they will strike America's East Coast with greater and greater force. They're worsening because of climate change. It's often said that Africa is the continent that will suffer worst from climate change. Is that because things are changing most profoundly in Africa? That has something to do with it. It also has to do with the poverty of those who live there.
Vulnerable populations.
Exactly. So we pay no attention to what's going on there at our own peril. I mean, quite literally at our own peril. The same is true when it comes to religion. There is a huge hunger for education in Africa and Asia, of course, in this area I call the global south, because that's what we're trying to move beyond these terms of developing world, because this world ain't developing toward us. If anything, we're going its direction. Addressing some of the grassroots organizations that are doing that work and getting beyond addressing failed states is really part of the solution.
For a final thought, how has this changed you? I don't want to be melodramatic, but on the other hand, this was quite a dramatic journey. How has it changed your worldview? What has had the most lasting impact on you?
You know, in a very, well, I'll tell you a story. I was in a car. Congo is not part of this book, but it's somewhere that I've reported quite a bit, and it's near this fault line. And I was in a pickup truck in eastern Congo at night, and we were on a logging road because there were no other roads. Then, of course, this rapacious logging company had come in to take their logging out, and of course, who else used the road? Well, rebels used it to come into an area they'd never been in and wreak havoc on people. Pygmies in particular, small people, forest people. I was going to meet with some of them. It was late at night, this was a war, and my driver and I got into a conversation about homosexuality, as you do, late at night on a Congolese road. He said to me, "You do not own God in the West. You guys might have brought the Bible here, but you left it here with us, and it's our time to bring it back to you. If you take the Bible from us, you leave us vulnerable to the double threats of Islam and homosexuality." That was radical for me to think, to get outside of my own context, which says, catch up, guys. Homosexuality is as in Africa as it is in anywhere else, and it is not an evil. To see how that works in other people's lives, to see how that worldview flips on itself, was very, very useful and informative.
And somewhat startling.
And startling.
Yeah, Eliza, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John.
Continued success, terrific book. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
In addition to thanking Eliza, we want to thank you. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue, and until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHz Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHz Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.